We're very pleased to have you all here. I'm Goodman. I'm Regents Professor and a few other things here at Georgia Tech. But in particular, I am, I guess, the de facto chair of our program committee. And I would like to start this off with a proper and very much appreciated acknowledgement of the three foundations that have supported this, have made this possible. They include the Rich Foundation, and Tom Asher, the president, is here. We're very pleased to have him. And I might note in that regard that the Rich brothers came here 150 years ago. This is the sesquicentennial of their start of one of the greatest commercial enterprises in the city of Atlanta, arguably. The second foundation to acknowledge is the Callahan Foundation. Is Lou Cercio here? He is supposed to be here. In any case, they are also supporting this, and they have in the past supported the other symposiums of this sort that we have done. Some of you may remember in December, November of 2015, we did a Ray Davis Legacy Symposium for the Korean War. Actually, the change in the U.S. And global security posture from 1945 to 1953. And we are happy. Lou will be here, I'm sure, very shortly. The third group is the Georgia Humanities Council. And is Jamil here? Yeah. Jamil. We have the president, who is also going to be on our program. There's a bio sketch of Jamil. We're very, very pleased to have the support of the Georgia Humanities Council. Part of what we're trying to do here, actually, is make the word humanities more prominent on this campus than it has been. I think it's to everybody's benefit if that becomes the case. And there will be a real focus on the people aspects of our subject matter today. There are a couple of other groups of people we'd like to thank. The program committee in particular will do this at the end as well, but I really think they deserve upfront acknowledgement. We'll probably have the largest audience that we have. We have Dougflamming, and we have Chris McDermott, and Mary Lou Suarez. Mary Lou is
in the lobby.
Mary Lou is, oh, she's at the desk outside. Mary Lou is the person, there she is back there, is the person who actually logistically makes this all happen. Not just this, but all sorts of other things within the Sam Nunn School, and she is much appreciated. And Rachel Brown, is Rachel here? Rachel hasn't arrived yet, who is effectively on the programming committee, and who is in fact responsible for a couple of the posters back there on Resilient Atlanta. And one last acknowledgement, and that is we have Larry Wandley, retired Air Force colonel, who became something of a major player in the world of antique books and prints and what have you, relating to the South, and particularly 19th century South. And he donated a whole bunch of books that are on the piano back there. And they are there for anyone to take. They're all used books. They're not antiques, but there are a lot of worthy books there. And in particular, we encourage the young people here, the students, to feel free to take whatever they want. The only request is that the 4-volume series from Alan Nevins be taken as a group rather than one book at a time. It is arguably the first of the really great multi-volume studies of the Civil War. Alan Nevins was a 2-time Pulitzer Prize winner and professor at Columbia, and that's among the books that Larry donated. And with that, let me turn this over to Steve Usselman, the chair of the History Department here, Department of History and Sociology, and the author of the quote that's in your playbill, which I think is a wonderful way to start this off. Steve?
Thank you, Cy, and good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, yes. It's wonderful to see so many of you here early on a Thursday morning, and you're in for a treat, I think. I had nothing to do with assembling this remarkable collection of papers you're going to hear, but I'm eager to hear them myself and to learn from them. Resilience. Resilience. Something we spend a lot of time thinking about at Georgia Tech, across the campus. We don't often associate it with the humanities and social sciences at Georgia Tech, but we are today. And beyond that, when I hear resilience, I say it's in the air. Just last year, Mayor Reed appointed a director of resilience for the city of Atlanta. This was part of a larger program in which many American mayors signed on to create directors of resilience, with the idea, fostered by President Obama, that we needed to assure that American cities were preparing to weather natural disasters and other calamities that might, one might say, will come their way. The notion that cities can bounce back and will need to is hardly unique to Atlanta. During the late 19th and early 20th century, city after city in the United States burned. Chicago, Baltimore, San Francisco, and yes, Atlanta. Not the burning of 1864, but the burning of 1917. Many European and Japanese cities were wholly rebuilt after World War II. There is, to be honest, nothing unique about a city rising from the ashes. Yet in Atlanta, such a resurrection is emblazoned on the city seal. And more than that, it lives in the collective consciousness of the city. It's evoked routinely as the defining moment in the city's history, and somehow the very essence of its being. The prevailing sense is that something fundamental and distinctive in human affairs happened here, in this region, in this city, indeed almost in this very spot. What was it? And why has it proved so enduring? That's what we're here to consider today. We have assembled a group of experts who have pursued this period with passion. And I want to underscore that the experts that have been assembled are not all professors. Some of them are, but many of them are people who have just spent their time and their energies and their passions trying to understand what went on in Atlanta. We've assembled them, and what particularly binds the speakers today, I think, is that they are people who, instead of focusing first on politics or newspapers, is that they dig in and just find out what was going on the ground by people who were responding to conditions facing them, who saw opportunities, who saw things that needed doing and got on with the business of doing them. And I think we're going to hear a lot today about people who we don't ordinarily hear about in the story of Atlanta. Now, those people went about their work under really extraordinary circumstances. It's not just circumstances of destruction, confusion, chaos, but a moment of abrupt changes in the nature of property rights and individual human freedom. A revolution more thorough and far more sudden than that of 1776. We sometimes forget that for many Atlantans, the city's rebirth was not merely a matter of rebuilding, but of constructing something new. The same forces that dashed the hopes of some had opened new worlds of possibility to many others. Above all, to those recently freed from bondage. Atlanta's rebirth mixed the tenaciousness of those looking to restore something that they sensed they had lost. It mixed that with the hope and promise, and to be sure the trepidation that sprang from broadened horizons. It is my highest hope that you will come away from today's symposium with a deeper appreciation of this complex story of resilience, and with a fuller understanding of why that story, this history, matters. Now with that, let me step aside and turn things over to our speakers, these experts who have dug so deeply, and uncover the lives and stories that bring us this subject to life. And I think today you're going to see people in action, and you'll see this, you'll see the history living. And the first of those is the man who just introduced me, Cy Goodman. Let me give a proper introduction to Cy. Cy is a Regents Professor, which is the highest distinction that the University System of Georgia bestows upon faculty at universities, state public universities in Georgia. He is, in fact, the only Regents Professor in our College of Liberal Arts at Georgia Tech, and we are proud of him. I personally am very proud that Cy has recently also accepted a position as an adjunct professor in our School of History and Sociology, which adds to his positions already in the School of International Affairs and in the College of Computing. So, with that background, Cy is going to talk about his true passion. Welcome, Cy. Welcome to you.
Let me start with a description, a very brief description, but it will give us some numbers to work with for the rest of my presentation and for you to think about over the course of the rest of the day. And that is, what did Atlanta look like, in very basic terms, at the beginning of the Civil War in 1860? We actually have a good census from 1860 to work on. As most of you, I suspect, appreciate, Atlanta is fairly unique in that it is a city that started in the 1830s, and it was essentially the only city that wasn't on a major body of water. And it was founded by a stake in the ground that literally was the terminus of a railroad that was going to be built down here from Chattanooga. And by 1860, by the time the war was about to start, we were the terminus, and we were called Atlanta by this time, for 4 railroads. In 1860, and a lot of people do not appreciate how small this town was at this point. In 1860, we had about 9,500 people in this city. And keep that number in mind, because it's going to be a kind of a standard to be measured against the other numbers that we talk about over the course of this symposium. The county, Fulton County, had about 11,500 people. The other counties in this neighborhood had between 2 and 11,000 people in them. Atlanta was essentially defined by a 1-mile radius from the center of town, where the railroads more or less got together. So it had roughly an area of 3.14 miles, right? Pi square miles. And compared to other places in the South and in the United States, we were really quite a small town. The largest city in this country and at this point was Manhattan Island. It was New York. It wasn't yet the New York of the 5 boroughs. New York had 806,000 people according to the 1860 census. The only city in what would become the 11 Confederate States that had more than 100,000 people was New Orleans, which was what it was because of its extraordinary location as a port. It's a port that, in fact, supported a good deal of the southern economy of the time. So Atlanta's really quite small, but what about Atlanta's neighbors and places that are going to pop up in the course of our discussion today? Nashville is of particular importance. Nashville was about double our size, 17,000 people. And actually, Nashville had 5 railroads running through it. Chattanooga was really even tinier. It only had about 2,500 people. The only city in Georgia that anyone had ever heard of, and one of the very few number of cities, only about 10 out of something on the order of 100 cities in the United States that had over 10,000 people. The only one in Georgia was Savannah with 22,000 people. So the urban status, if you'd like, of the cities in the 11 states that were going to become the Confederacy, or at least try to become the Confederacy. The urban status, and with that there's this industrial base that's going to be necessary to fight the first really big war of the industrial era, which in fact is going to depend rather significantly in many ways on those railroads, in addition to a number of other technologies that we don't have time to talk about. The point to be made in the talk that I'm going to be giving is that the descent of Atlanta from the reasonably prosperous growing town of 1860 to what it was going to be like by the spring of 1865, that descent, as I will describe, began almost immediately, and in ways that most people don't appreciate. A lot happened here that was really quite negative from a human standpoint before Sherman arrived. And we'll start talking about that year by year. I don't have a lot of visuals. I thought about finding visuals to do this, but most of what I'm going to talk about, frankly, is going to be about human misery. And there weren't, even though the Civil War was the first big war to be extensively photographed, there frankly isn't much on that. And so try to put together a mental image of what I'm going to be describing. We have a few scenes that were taken after Sherman had gotten here of some of the physical destruction. Some of those pictures are on the posters in the back. But try to sort of imagine the human context of what I'm going to be talking about for roughly the next half hour. In 1861, the key word is mobilization. The United States, in its 2 forms that were going to fight this war, went through the most extraordinary, one of the most extraordinary mobilizations for war in the history of the whole planet. We went, to summarize the larger picture, we went from one army of 16,000 men in the course of 4 years to 2 armies of 3 million men, on a population base of about 30 million. Okay? That is truly extraordinary. There's been nothing like it in this country since, in World War II. And it was, in fact, by far the most destructive war in our history, by far. Okay, and we're going to get a picture of just how bad that was here, which was as bad as it was any place in this country, either before or since, or certainly during the Civil War. So what did mobilization look like? I want to try to go through the next 4 years at about 5 minutes each. Mobilization basically started out with having to put men into an army that didn't exist at the beginning of the war, and that was going to be built up, have to be built up rather quickly to fight a war with one of the world's really significant emerging industrial powers. And men from the ages of 18 to 35 in large numbers went into the Confederate Army. Ultimately, this is going to be men between the ages of 15 to 50. And what did these men look like? And what did their departure into the Army do to the economy and the social structure of Atlanta in particular, but the 11 Confederate states more generally? Most of these men were heads of households or the eldest son in a household. Okay? And by the economy of the time, they were essentially the most productive people in that household. And the image you might want to have, it's only part of it, is that of a family farm. The family was the most important social unit down here at this time. Okay, and then the extended family, and then there's the small communities. And what we're doing when these men went into the Army, when they formed a company of something approaching 100 men, and went off, usually by train, to some part of the South to fight this war, or a regiment, which is roughly about 1,000 men. What we're doing when those men leave those households is taking the most productive people and turning them into the worst kind of consumers. They go into the Army. This is not such a big deal if this is going to be a short war, which a whole bunch of people on both sides thought it was going to be. But it was going to be a really long war. And ultimately, and from the standpoint of Fulton County, 86% of the men between the ages of 15 to 50 went into the Confederate Army. What this does to the social structure and the productivity and the economic well-being of the city and its environment is hard to basically overestimate. What they left behind were families deprived of the most productive people, societies deprived of their most productive people. And these people, as I said, become the worst kinds of consumers because they are no longer, for example, actively participating in making food. They are out there consuming food. They're consuming everything. People in armies are terribly wasteful. And these folks have essentially been removed from the productive elements of the economy. And what is there to replace them? And down here in the South, the answer turns out to be not much. Okay? Food in particular is going to become a big issue. This mobilization problem at the family level, at the town level, at the city level in the South is compounded by something else. And not only do the most productive members of the family, the head of the household or the oldest son or sons, go into the Army, but so do their horses and mules. This is a war that I've described, for example, as the first really big war of the industrial era. Okay. but a whole lot of it was fought. Think of cavalry, think of artillery, the two of the three combat arms, and especially think of what it took to move all of the supplies, all of the ammunition, all of the everything, large armies. Now we're going to start talking about armies of 20 to 100,000 men. And think of how many mules and horses were needed to make that happen. Okay. And where do you find them? Well, you're starting with nothing. And you cannot start immediately making grown horses and mules. So you take them away from the households that have them. One other thing for 1861, where mobilization is the theme for at least this part of my talk, is that the Confederacy has to start building the kind of industry that can support the kind of war that is going to be fought, which will be extraordinarily consuming. Okay. So start to picture something on the order of 20 field armies on both sides over the course of this war, with each field army running from 10 to 100,000 men. And think about the kind of ammunition consumption that they might have, not to mention the feeding problem that they have, or the feeding problem for all those horses and mules. And you have to start building an industry that will support that. And Atlanta, because it was a rail center, was perhaps by default compared to the rest of the South, and New Orleans basically was not a manufacturing center of any consequence at all. It was the only city in the South with more than 40,000 people in it. And what had to be done had to be built on some sort of infrastructure, and Atlanta was a natural place to start building industry. And we'll talk about some of that industry in a moment. But Atlanta at least had enough of an industrial infrastructure to support the maintenance and sustain those 4 railroads. It had machine shops, it had some iron works, it had some local transportation to move goods off of the freight cars from one rail line to the other, or to all sorts of other places. But Atlanta at least had that much infrastructure, which most southern cities did not have. And then we're going to build on that. So let's move to 1862. If mobilization is the core, this kind of industrial development that is about to start in real earnest here is going to turn out to be a form of false prosperity by the end of the war. It's going to be more trouble than it was worth from a human standpoint. 1862, from our standpoint for the next 5 minutes, is characterized by the contraction of the Confederacy. The Confederacy started to shrink from the very beginning of the war. Around here in particular, all hopes for adding the star, which is actually on all of the Confederate flags for Kentucky, disappeared. Most of Tennessee disappeared. Much of the the Mississippi Valley disappeared. Okay? All of these parts were lost to the Confederacy. And what that meant for Atlanta was a transfer of people, mostly in the form of refugees, but also in the form of added responsibilities that were piled onto this place and that were going to actually contribute rather significantly to Atlanta's descent. So in particular, Nashville was lost in February of 1862, essentially without a shot being fired. And then Nashville became, with its 5 railroads, a major federal U.S. logistics center. And the responsibilities that Nashville had, not to mention the various refugees that left Nashville because they wanted to stay with the Confederacy, or left Memphis, which was also lost in 1862, or other parts of both Kentucky and some of the Mississippi Valley states, we started to have a flow of refugees into this town. Refugees are not necessarily the best kind of people to have adding to your burden. And in addition to, if you like, the railroad functions that were in effect transferred down here, there was the industry that was building up in Nashville that at least partly came down here. And the most important example of that was the arsenal that they had in Nashville. And one of the areas that we built up in Atlanta to support the war industrially was an arsenal down here, which became one of the major manufacturers of ammunition for the Confederacy. One of the really few commodities. We started building industries that put out swords and what have you, but that frankly didn't add up to much. But one of the few commodities that was absolutely necessary for the Confederacy to continue the war was basically the small arms industry, and in particular the ammunition producing part of it. And there was an axis between here and Augusta that produced an enormous amount of it. Other things that were forming in terms of industry, just to give you a couple examples, were textile mills to make things out of cloth like uniforms, and maybe not necessarily cloth like shoes or what have you, but all of this was an additional burden on what was already a fragile economy to support large armies, which consumed things in great numbers. One textile mill of note employed about 400 or 500 people, mostly women. This is what's going to happen in terms of who actually bakes the stuff that this industry is coming up with. There is the arsenal, which ultimately will be employing about 5,500 people. Remember, the population was 9,500 to start with. Where are these people coming from? And what are they doing to this town? And we became, as you probably can gather, a major quartermaster depot, redistribution center for gathering things up, not just the stuff that's made in Atlanta, but made in all sorts of other places, and transshipping all this stuff, including a whole lot of Confederate soldiers, to other parts of the country. Something else started to happen in 1862 in significant numbers. And in addition to the visitors that came here from various sources, the refugees from Tennessee, for example, or the people who were essentially the family remnants that were left on the outskirts of Atlanta, could no longer, because they no longer had their mule or their father or their eldest son or what have you, to run some of these hardscrabble farms. These people sort of came into town. Other folks that came into town that added burdens here were the sick and wounded from the Confederate Army. And being sick and wounded in the Civil War was being sick and wounded in ways that, and Marty will talk more about this, but basically in ways that were very difficult to treat. People got sick. We didn't know much about medicine. We didn't have money to doctors. We didn't have the facilities. We didn't have anything really to deal with this kind of infusion, which is going to start numbering in the tens of thousands before we're finished here. 1863. The population of Atlanta by the end of 1863 had worked its way up to roughly 20,000. I could give you more exact numbers, but frankly, numbers from the Confederates, we're lucky if we get close. Right? 1863, we had a population up to about 20,000. We had all these people doing these war-related kinds of stuff, like the 5,500 people working in the arsenal, or what have you. By the way, there's this great exhibit of what went on in this arsenal at the Atlanta History Center, which shows how mostly women, I mean, all the men have gone off to war. There's hardly anything left, okay? And you can't use the slaves, who made up about 20% of Atlanta's population at the beginning of the war, to do this kind of work for all kinds of reasons, at least at this stage of the game. So it's mostly women is doing this, and there's this great exhibit showing, and you look at this and you figure, oh my God, people do this for 10 hours a day, but it shows women making bullets. And we also, in that arsenal, made something on the order of supposedly 41 million percussion caps. These are absolutely necessary for what was essentially the kinds of armaments that fought that war, at least on land. So all of these burdens are working their way up in 1863. By the end of 1863, a major front had opened up in eastern Tennessee, and it was clearly going to be aimed in this direction. And you had, in particular, towards the end of that year, the largest and most devastating in terms of human casualties battle in the Western Theater, namely Chickamauga. And you had the campaign around Chattanooga that ultimately left Sherman and Grant in charge of Chattanooga. And you start to have this much greater flow of both refugees and especially of the sick and wounded. And the foreboding, which resulted in a new industry down here, and that is building fortifications and expanding the hospital facilities. There were at least, according to Wendy's book, 26 hospitals in this town. Remember, this is a town that is defined by a 1 mile radius, a circle with a 1 mile radius. And we had 26 hospitals. And starting with December of 1863, and then going to July of 1864, we're going to get there in a minute, we had 45,000 sick and wounded Confederate soldiers coming into this town. What do you do with them? Well, one image, for example, that technically could have been the case, but it may have been Hollywood liberties, is that image you have from the movie Gone with the Wind, with all of these sick and wounded people basically spread all over the streets of the city. It probably didn't come to that, okay, but it came close. Food shortages are becoming extreme. You have people doing everything except growing food. The kinds of food that had supplied Atlanta in the past with regard to livestock and what have you, we couldn't get to it. You couldn't get all these cattle in Texas, couldn't really get here. All the horses and all kinds of other animals that were characteristic of Kentucky and Tennessee, they couldn't get here anymore either. We're getting down to a food situation that was absolutely desperate. We were among the various Confederate cities that had bread riots. But in general, all the people who were left here, including a growing number of widows and orphans, were in desperate shape when it came to just basic food needs. Okay. So you have all of this accumulating over a period now of 3 years. Okay. You have the railroads with the soot and the grease and the filth that comes with trying to keep the railroads going. The Confederacy just barely could keep these railroads going. They inherited a decent infrastructure at the beginning of the war. but they did not have the capabilities of building more infrastructure. The best they could do is maintain what they had. And it shows up especially strongly here in Atlanta. Okay? And you have all kinds of people, the sick, the wounded, the Confederate soldiers going up to the front, the refugees coming through here and what have you, and all sorts of animals coming along with them. And we had a slaughterhouse, by the way, in this town. And so all these people and animals that go into and out of Atlanta, none of them cleaned up after themselves. To be really crude. This place was unbelievably filthy and unsanitary and cluttered. It really, there's just no way other than describing it as briefly as I can to make that clear. There is no photograph of this stuff. People are complaining, you read diaries and what have you, of the incredible stench, but people get used to it. The unsanitary conditions, particularly with regard to all of those sick and wounded people who couldn't really be treated. They couldn't even be shoved out of town. We had a major hospital here that was called the redistributing hospital, essentially, that clocked all of the Confederate soldiers that came in, and they tried to ship them out to places like Macon. Nobody else could take them. They clearly overran the hospitals that we had available. Let me rush through 1864, which is a big year, by the way. We were employing the African Americans, mostly slaves, in various ways. They were no longer growing cotton. They weren't doing very good. None of the plantations or other farms that we had around here. We were not a big plantation part of the South. But we weren't growing real food in the quantities that were necessary to feed the kinds of population that we were developing. African Americans were increasingly employed to do the field work of building the kinds of fortifications. You've all seen photographs of that. Actually, there's a whole lot of it around here. And in fact, African American women made up most of the staff in all of those hospitals. We didn't have enough doctors. We didn't have enough orderlies. Basically, we had a whole lot of African American women in those so-called hospitals. It's not a term that describes anything we know today. And essentially all they did was try to make people reasonably comfortable and clean up after them. But it was impossible to clean up anything in this town, to be perfectly honest. So 1864, May of 1864, sees William T. Sherman leaving Chattanooga, the Chattanooga area, with an army group actually, 3 armies, of 100,000 men. He's going to be opposed by an army essentially based out of Atlanta, in a strong logistical sense, okay, of about 62,000 men, led by Joseph Johnston. And these 160,000 men are going to be fighting each other down this corridor, this railroad corridor from Chattanooga to Atlanta. And as they get closer, things get worse for Atlanta. The number of sick and wounded grows tremendously. By the way, one misery people flow that didn't come through here were the 46,000 poor souls who got incarcerated in Andersonville. The railroad system simply couldn't cope with them. Most of them came from Grant's overland campaign in Virginia, and they bypassed Atlanta and went through Macon. That's the last thing this town needed. Sherman gets close. The town sort of self-evacuates. He comes up with, he basically starts to shell the city, which is psychologically very traumatic. There are some pictures of the after effect of this, but neither the guns nor the ammunition of the time could actually do the kind of damage that people associate with artillery bombarding cities. That really wasn't available until, in big time, until World War I. Okay, but psychologically, it just upset people down here, something fierce. Okay. We have this, we could actually see that from this campus, the Ponder House, of this white building that was shot at by the Union artillerists. They brought in some particularly big guns, and they couldn't even really destroy the Ponder House. But psychologically, it was devastating. Only about 20 people were killed, but the town started to self-evacuate. At the very end of this, when Sherman finally cut the last railroad, the one that went down through Jonesboro, and the city was no longer tenable in the sense of being defended by the Confederate Army, and the Confederate Army was going to evacuate. They had this problem of having somewhere between 60 and 80 boxcars loaded with ammunition, and they couldn't get it out of town, and they couldn't support the Confederate Army anymore. Okay? Most of it, I believe, and this is going to be terribly ironic, was made by the ladies working at the arsenal in town. And they blew it up. And so that image that you have actually in Gone with the Wind with this wall of fire and what have you was not Sherman's doing. It was the Confederates rather incompetently blowing up 60 or more boxcars full of ammunition. And the pictures you have after that, and I think we have one of them out there somewhere, basically makes this town look like Hiroshima, or at least that part, of what was undoubtedly the largest explosion in the entire Civil War. Nothing could come close to that, not what they did in the crater or anything else. At this point, Sherman comes in. And they start mechanically to beat up the town, to basically destroy the industry, the railroad structures, and what have you, by knocking them down. They weren't setting anything on fire. Sherman then did something else that is really worth noting, and that is he expelled the population of the town. Everybody out. We're not sure how many people were actually in town when he arrived, maybe 2,000 to 5,000, down from the 20,000. But he expelled them all, except for the people he kept, who were mostly African Americans, to sort of help the Union Army settle in. These people, and you have this imagery in Gone with the Wind, the movie as well, these people were expelled and they were essentially put on the road to go wherever they could go, with whatever they could carry. And they didn't have much in the way of horses and wagons left at this point to carry much. And so everybody in the town became a refugee. And in the worst instance of the entire war, which sort of boggles the mind because of how unnecessary it was, Sherman not simply expelled, but in a fit of whatever that's hard to explain, exiled about 400 women workers at a textile mill in Roswell. He essentially put them on trains and shipped them off to Indiana. I want to talk about breaking up families. And that was that. So you can imagine what is happening now with all of this people movement to the social structure, the families and what have you, that existed in this town beforehand and before the war started, and how these things are going to eventually get put back together again. Sherman moves on in November to head off to Savannah. Essentially, both armies leave Atlanta. Okay. Hood takes what's left of the Army of Tennessee up to Tennessee. To make a long story short, Sherman sends Thomas after him. Okay. Ultimately, the army of the Confederate Army is destroyed outside of Nashville and Franklin. Sherman himself takes two of his armies off to Savannah. There is a Confederate cavalry group that harasses them rather marginally on this trip. And what they're doing, besides abandoning the town, immediately upon the departure of the army, something on the order, God only knows where this number came from, but it's from a source that is usually pretty good. 1,500 people descended on this town and looted it for everything that it was worth. Town was depopulated. It has been described in various ways as not just depopulated, but overrun by packs of dogs, having thousands of rotting corpses of mules and horses, with what few people were still left living in bomb-proofs, that's basically holes in the ground, in shanties, and what was left of the buildings, and there were actually perhaps more buildings left than some people think. None of them were in really great shape. This is what the town looked like when the two armies departed. Now, moving to 1865 quickly, because I've run over, but I thought, what the hell? I mean, the story really needs to be told. And most of this damage was not done by Sherman. When he left, his people burned a whole bunch of other things and knocked down a whole bunch of things. But this is the state of the human population and the animal population of the Atlanta area at the end of 1864, the beginning of 1865. I mean, it wasn't just ashes. It was total physical misery, and there couldn't have been a happy person in this town at this point. Okay? There wasn't a single, I suspect, coherent family that didn't suffer some terrible loss, both of property and of humans. The Confederate Army probably suffered, these numbers are a bit tricky, what have you, 25 to 30% mortality, most of it due to disease. There's every reason to suspect that the people here suffered similarly. The mortality rates, by the way, on both sides of horses and mules during the course of this war was 50%. That sort of boggles the mind by any kind of standard that we have today. Horses and mules were literally worked to death. Okay? Any of you saw the movie War Horse or what have you, that's World War I, where it's even worse. But it's exactly what happened here. Now, to end this by passing this along to the folks who are going to tell you how things got better, very briefly, somehow or other, we put things together. I mean, we had a scene here that is in many ways worse than the scenes you had after World War II, when all the bombed out cities, or the cities that had been overrun by the Red Army, where people are basically picking up one brick at a time and knocking off the mortar and stacking bricks so that they can start rebuilding. That happened fairly quickly. And actually, by the spring of 1865, we were reasonably well on our way, and fairly miraculously, and this did not happen to any other southern city, and no other southern city suffered anywhere near as much as us, but we actually had all 4 railroads running again, at least minimally. And to end this on what was an interesting note, one of the newspapers came back, the Atlanta Intelligencer. And at this point, once the railroads were sort of all running again, it actually described in a way that I will read you. Okay. In March 1865, the Atlanta Intelligencer, which was actually publishing again, actually wrote the following. Okay. It happened, again, March 1865. The war was still on, by the way. Okay. Appomattox was in April. Soon the other railroads will form a connection with our city and then from the ashes, phoenix-like. Okay. Does it sound familiar? Atlanta will rise to resume her former importance in Georgia and the South. There was the ultimate resilience statement. Okay, Doug?
Should I introduce you? Just want to take a look.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Thank you. I'm Dougflamming, professor of history here at Georgia Tech, and I am delighted to introduce to you our next two speakers. I'll introduce them both at the same time, and they can go one after another. Cy Goodman has taken Atlanta to the depths. Immediate needs then had to be addressed. Our next two talks deal with the way in which real people on the ground dealt with the immediate needs of Atlanta in crisis. Atlanta was a railroad town. Under normal circumstances, I might not fall over when I lift this up. If I do, I'm all right. I'm just unbalanced. No, wait, that didn't come out. I'm not unbalanced. Who knows what this is?
Sledgehammer.
It is a sledgehammer, but it's a special type of sledgehammer. It is, in fact, a railroad sledgehammer, a maul, and because you have to drive in the stake over the rail and into the wood. So it has to be longer on one end. I would like to see a show of hands for those who have done this. Our next speaker has. Our next speaker is Martin Moran, MD, not PhD, but we claim him in the historical profession not only because he's a fine historian and has published 2 history books, but because he is just a heck of a person. He worked his way through college and then medical school by driving in railroad stakes in the copper mines of Arizona in 110-degree heat. And if anybody out there says, but it's dry heat, I've got a sledgehammer and I'm not afraid to use it. He became a doctor, served 5 years in the Army, the U.S. Army, and I believe retired as a colonel. Is that
Major.
Major?
I quit the Army.
I apologize. The major quit. Doggone it. But then he came to Atlanta and he set up shop as a pediatrician in 1969. And for decades he took care of Atlanta's children. Now, you can read about his biography, as with all the other speakers, in the program. But I will say, if you drive railroad spikes to become a doctor and serve in the Army and then take care of one city's children for over 3 decades, then you deserve a gift. And this is my gift to you, Doctor. It's for you to keep.
I do, really, I appreciate that. trying to forget this for the last 40 years.
Sorry, historian. Dr. Moran will be speaking on Atlanta's health before, during, and after the conflict. Following Dr. Moran will be Charles Crawford, who is a fixture in Atlanta and Georgia Tech. He is the head of the Georgia Battlefield Association, a great historian in his own right, a tremendous friend to Georgia Tech. He is an IT specialist. He served nearly a quarter century in the U.S. Air Force. And then, did you retire or did you quit? Anyway, he's a good friend of Georgia Tech, and in fact is formally a friend of the School of Mathematics, which Georgia Tech students would say is an oxymoron. But, oh, that was a good line, come on. He will speak to us on the often unexplored topic of the U.S. Army's role in the rebuilding of Atlanta. So first, I welcome Martin Moran to talk about health, and then I welcome Charlie Crawford to talk about Union rebuilding. I will revisit this podium. I thank you. I will revisit this podium prior to lunch, and will remind you that lunch is free and open to the public, whether you are SVP'd or not. Dr. Moran.
Thank you.
I spent the last 50 years trying to forget that hammer. My father was an Irish immigrant and worked in the coal mines in Wales before he came to the United States. And because of asthma, we ended up moving to a small town in Arizona, which put me through college. Although I have to admit, in this group, I did not graduate from college. I quit to go work in the mines, to go to medical school, and it was fine with everybody. I'm here to talk about healthcare. But let me go back a step to reiterate some of what Cy said. The state of Georgia had a governor by the name of Willard Lumpkin in the early 1830s. He was a proponent of railroads, toll roads, canals, and public schools. After he left office, a group of railroad executives met in Macon and talked about building a railroad from Chattanooga and the Tennessee River down to West DeKalb County. In 1837, they put a stake in, and then 5 years later, they moved that stake, and they put it about 2 or 3 blocks southeast of what we call 5 Points today. In 1842, the town was named Marthasville. They tried to name it Lumpkinville for the governor, but there was already a county in North Georgia named that. He said he felt it was confusing, so they named it for his daughter. In 1945, 3 things happened. Number one is the name was changed from Marthasville to Atlanta. And the other thing that happened is the railroad came from Augusta to Atlanta. The third thing was the first physician arrived. Look, I'm not an engineer. How do I start this thing? Where's Chris?
Do the arrows on the keyboard. Try the arrows on.
I'm technologically illiterate. Thank you. First physician arrives in the community, Joshua Gilbert. He is grew up in Clemson, South Carolina, goes to Augusta Medical College, and comes to Marthasville in the summer, right after graduation. He sets up an office on Marietta Street. And He never really entered the Civil War, but took care of the wounded at Ezra Church. My wife and I found his gravesite in southwest Atlanta, and I hired somebody for $207 to go clean it, sandblast his gravestone. My friends thought I was insane, but it's the only white gravestone in the cemetery. In 1853, several things happened. First thing was that Fulton County was formed from the western end of DeKalb County. Number two is the John Westmoreland, a physician from Monticello, Georgia, graduated from Augusta Medical College in 1843, practices in his hometown, and comes to Atlanta in 1853. First thing he does is he organizes physicians into something called the Brotherhood of Physicians, which today is the Medical Association of Atlanta. The next thing he does, he has a code of ethics written, which physicians agree to. The next thing he does, he starts a fee schedule so that a patient living in the hinterlands would know that if that doctor took a horse ride 5 miles and set his arm that was fractured, what the fee would be. It's probably the first HMO that we had in society. But an outstanding individual. The following year, he petitions the state of Georgia to start a medical school, and the state grants it. The first classes were held at City Hall and in his office. They were held at City Hall in empty rooms. In 1855, the cornerstone was laid on it was Butler Street and Jenkins Street, which today would probably correspond to Jesse Hill and Armstrong. And this is the medical school. This building stayed working until 1906, until it was torn down. It was the first private medical facility in Atlanta. This is Willis Westmoreland, his brother. Comes to Atlanta in 1855, is an outstanding surgeon. This is Dr. Noel Diavigna. But let me back up a step. In 1849, the city of Atlanta has its first outbreak of smallpox. A young physician by the name of James Alexander, just graduated from Augusta Medical College, volunteers to take care of these people. A building was set outside the city limits, and these people were isolated from the rest of the community. Everybody survived, which is unheard of. Smallpox traditionally has a mortality rate of 30 to 40%. What he did, he probably just fed them. He had nothing magical about it, but he became a folk hero in the city. He ran for mayor twice, and both times he lost. His opponents would say he would make a fine mayor, but when he becomes a mayor, you're going to lose a great doctor. So all of his patients voted against him. It's really kind of an interesting story. We had another smallpox epidemic again in 1853, and the city did the same thing. Built a facility outside the city limits and isolated people. I look around, a lot of young people have no clue about smallpox. Smallpox is the greatest killer of human beings in the history of our species for a disease. In the 20th century alone, smallpox killed a minimum of 300 million people. And you have to realize that was only in 75% of the century. Smallpox disappeared from our world, theoretically, in 1977. 300 million people. When I was in the Army, one of my responsibilities was taking care of the immunization clinic in 1967 over at Fort McPherson. We had 15 million cases of smallpox in 1967 with 2 million deaths. It is just absolutely mind-boggling what that disease did. By 1860, we have 41 physicians in the community. The war starts in April of '61. The medical school closed down in August of '61. And the reason why was to turn it over into a hospital. All the classrooms, the desks and chairs were removed, and beds were put into the building. By early 1862, the Confederate military needed more hospitals in this city. Over 24 facilities were turned into hospitals. Hotels, the Gate City Hotel, the Empire House. There was a school for young females, the Female Institute, young ladies, and that turned into a hospital. Homes were turned into hospitals. Schools were turned into hospitals. Mind-boggling problem. The Confederate military then built 40 buildings on the fairgrounds for the future ill and wounded. The fairgrounds were slightly southeast of Oakland Cemetery, across the street on Memorial Drive, and slightly southeast of Oakland Cemetery. By 1862, a notice went out that the South had very few drugs left. The Navy blockade prevented quinine from coming from South America. And the blockade on the borders prevented other drugs from coming across the border. So the people of Atlanta responded to folklore. They started using dogwood berries to make quinine for malaria. They started using ripe persimmons to fight dysentery. They started using cherry tree bark to take care of all lung diseases, which were tuberculosis, pneumonia, bronchitis. None of it worked. They also started growing poppies to make opium for pain relief. Smallpox again showed up in Atlanta in late 1862. By January and February of 1863, there were 400 cases. This had a mortality rate of about 30%. Dr. Willis Westmoreland stepped forward and said, let us have compulsory vaccination for the citizens. Anybody grew up in New York City? God, unbelievable. In 1947, when I was 11 years old, we had a smallpox scare in New York. A man and his wife from Maine visited Mexico City, came to New York back on a Greyhound bus, and got off, and he had a rash. And he went to Bellevue Hospital. He had a vaccination scar on his arm. So they thought he had a drug reaction, which is quite possible. He ended up dying of smallpox. New York City, and I remember this clearly, mobilized 6 million people received a smallpox vaccination within 3 weeks. Every church, synagogue, theater, school, baseball field, football field, there was somebody in a white uniform, and you had to roll up your sleeve. There was no consent. But the South, during this time, was slow to adopt vaccinations. It's unbelievable how slow they were. As a result, untold deaths occurred because of this lackadaisical attitude towards vaccination. Vaccination kills people. There's no question about it. From the New York episode, the CDC comes out with their numbers that 1 to 2 people per million vaccines will die from the disease, from the vaccine. We had several people die in New York. A child got generalized, what we call, they had eczema, and the smallpox took the child's life. Willis Westmoreland, again, wanted to compulsory vaccinate people. And they did, but the problem was, like I said, people were coming in and out of the city, nobody knew who they were. It was very difficult to achieve. In 1864, when Sherman was helping burn the city down, there were the medical school, the Atlanta Medical College, survived. And it survived because of a gentleman, Noel D'Avignon. We all know how conception takes place. He almost was never born. His parents were French aristocrats. They were arrested by the reign of terror. They were going to be executed. Robespierre was arrested. He was executed. His parents were freed, and he was born in 1800. He ended up at Waterloo. He was involved in a revolution in France in 1830 with tried to put Charles X back on the throne. He's exiled to the United States. His wife dies. He goes to Charleston. His wife dies of yellow fever. He comes to Atlanta, and he is in charge of the hospital. A Union soldier went up to the hospital, told him it was going to be burned to evacuate the wounded. D.L. Vigney had dressed his orderlies with bloody bandages, gave them a little extra alcohol, so they moaned and groaned, and he convinced the officer that nobody, he's been in two armies, the French army and the Confederate army, nobody had ever burned the hospital down. The officer said, "I'm coming back tomorrow," he never did, and so the hospital was saved. This was a major issue for the future of Atlanta medicine. He is Dr. Meade in Gone with the Wind. As I said, there was a great deal of hunger in the city. Poor people could not get bread. And one of the reasons they could not get bread, all the grains were being used to make whiskey. The diet for poor people, widows, orphans, and poor blacks with no jobs, was cornmeal and molasses. One of the major diseases the South had was pellagra. In 1865, the city of Atlanta suffered for several months chills and fever. It was malaria. There was no quinine. Malaria, one of the main complications of malaria is anemia. It also can kill you with pneumonia, and can kill you with going to your brain, getting cerebral malaria. But anemia is a major problem. With pellagra, it's a disease of the 4 Ds: diarrhea, dermatitis, dementia, and death in 4 or 5 years. It was endemic in the South with a diet of cornmeal and molasses. The South never learned how to treat corn properly. If you go to your grocery store and buy a bag of tortillas, you look it up, on the bottom of it, it'll say corn and lime. They treated the Native Americans, Indians in Mexico, Aztecs, all treated their corn with lime. If you don't treat corn with lime, all you're getting is empty calories. Lime frees up niacin. It's an essential ingredient for our health, for our skin and our brain. This is Atlanta in 1864 when it seems. This is Dr. O'Keefe, an Irish immigrant, comes to the United States from Limerick during the potato famine, ends up in New Orleans where he migrates to Augusta, is accepted to medical school, and he comes back into Atlanta. He is an important figure in the development of public schools for children. Now, these are for white children. White children, poor white children, were not getting educated. Wealthy and middle-class white kids were, and black children were getting educated through the Freedmen's Bureau, but poor whites were not. He initiated the public school system idea for the city of Atlanta. O'Keefe High School was here. I think the O'Keefe building is on the campus. Samuel Stout came to Atlanta, outstanding physician. He was responsible during the war for 60 hospitals, Confederate hospitals, in Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, Tennessee, and Georgia. After the war was over, he came and was on the faculty of the medical school. I'll talk about Abner Calhoun in a second. Another disease endemic in the South was hookworm. The ancient Egyptians knew about hookworm. It's on their hieroglyphics. We knew that hookworm existed in animals. In 1899, a young American physician, Ashford Bailey, goes to Puerto Rico after the Spanish-American War. It's an idyllic place, and he wants to know, why do people die in Puerto Rico? And the answer was anemia. He checked into it, and he started the Puerto Rican Anemia Commission. And they come to the conclusion that it was hookworm. In 1901, Joel Hurt, the entrepreneur, businessman, the Hurt Building, he had some hound dogs that were dying. He takes them to several vets. No vet knows what it has. So Hurt takes his dogs to see Claude Smith, a pathologist at Grady Hospital. And Claude Smith says, I don't know what's wrong with them, but bring them back when they're dead. They do. He does an autopsy, and he finds hookworm. A prisoner dies in a city jail at the same time. He does an autopsy on him. It was hookworm. He goes out to the Chattahoochee Brick Company and checks the stools of 20 prisoners and finds hookworm in 2 of them. The next thing he does, this is all before parental consent and patient consent, he takes soil contaminated with hookworm, puts it on the wrist of a convict that did not have hookworm, let it sit for about an hour, removed the dirt, the skin was inflamed, and the man had hookworm in his stools within a few days. So the South, frequently poor blacks and poor whites were labeled lazy. They had 3 diseases that did this. One of them was malaria, number 2 was pellagra, and number 3 was hookworm. Abner Calhoun came to Atlanta, and first of all, he was born in Noonan, Georgia, in 1845. He joins the Confederate Army. He's at the Army of Northern Virginia. He's actually at Appomattox when Lee surrenders. Gets out of the Army, goes to Jefferson Medical School, then goes to Europe, where he becomes the first eye, ear, nose, and throat doctor in the state of Georgia. He trains in Vienna and Berlin. Comes back to Atlanta, participates in healthcare, and he did cataract surgery in 1890. He removed cataracts from a 3-month-old child born with congenital cataracts. By 1892, he had done over 900 cases. Now, it's not the cataract surgery that some of us have had in this room, where they take out your lens, throw it away, put a new lens in. You had to wear those kind of Coke bottle glasses, but at least you could see. And this is smallpox. Again, the South was slow to accept vaccinations. Vaccination, as we know it, started in the late 1790s from Dr. Jenner in Great Britain. But the Chinese and in India were inoculating people for well over 1,000 years before the revolution. What they were doing is making a cut on your arm, a cross cut, taking a scab and putting it into the wound and getting a scab from somebody who's recovering from smallpox, shoving it in there with a piece of lint, and it worked very well. George Washington insisted that all of his troops be inoculated against smallpox. Congress was opposed to it, but he went ahead and did it anyway. But this is typical smallpox. We had, again, epidemics in Atlanta in 49, 53, 62, and then in 65. This is malaria. Malaria, probably the last year killed about 670,000 people in the world. The question is, what kind of malaria did we have here in Atlanta? Probably Vivax, which is not deadly. It's debilitating, makes you anemic. And if you have malaria from Vivax and get another disease, say you have hookworm or get pellagra, you will probably die. But by itself, the malaria that the South had was debilitating but not deadly. The malaria that you see in Africa is falciparum malaria, which is deadly. So there is a difference. And this is that's the Plasmodium organism, the dark spot. It's a single cell. It enters into the red blood cell and then multiplies asexually, blows up the cell, so you become anemic. During the epidemic of smallpox in 1865, in the January and February, we had an outbreak of scarlet fever. Now, scarlet fever today is not much. Come into my office with scarlet fever on Monday, I'll give you penicillin at 10 o'clock, and your afebrile by Tuesday morning. No treatments at this time. This illness killed people. Number one is a germ, is streptococcus, got into your bloodstream and kill people. Number two is it causes rheumatic fever. And number three is it can cause what we call glomerulonephritis. The second administrator of Grady Hospital died from glomerulonephritis from strep infection like this. And this is pellagra. Now, this is the worst case scenario, but I think personally that there was subclinical pellagra in the South, in Atlanta. It had to be. You cannot eat cornmeal and molasses and not have a niacin deficiency. It is just not possible. You're lazy, you're depressed, you have dementia, you have diarrhea, and you have this rash. You're sun intolerant. So anywhere sun was exposed, hands, forearms, and around the neck, this is the disease you had. This was very, very common in the mental institutions, especially in the South in the late 19th century. To save money, the government gave them a diet of corn. And the corn was never treated properly with lime. And the other disease, hookworm. Hookworm is endemic in the South. It's still here. And your mother would tell you, wear your shoes when you're out running on the grass. That was the reason. She may not have known what the reason was, but that's the reason. The hookworm passes your eggs through your stool. It's on the ground. You're walking through on the earth with no shoes on. It penetrates the skin, migrates through your body, gets into your lungs, into your trachea. You cough, goes into your intestinal tract. One of these hookworms will eat up 1 cc of blood a day. If you have an infection of 300, 400, 500 of these creatures in your intestinal tract, you will be anemic. This also causes death. And the reason why is simply because you go into heart failure. You're going to become severely anemic and you're going to go into heart failure. Venereal disease, very, very common. No treatment. Treatment probably killed more people. Actually, there was a treatment. It was called calomel, which probably killed more people than the bloodletting that we used to do in this country. It's a mercury combination, and we haven't used it for makeup. Very devastating for a while. We use it for teething for infants. Very devastating for a while. And again, it's a syphilis. At that time, I thought syphilis and gonorrhea were the same thing. It was a venereal disease. They had no clue that they were anything different. Now, Atlanta did well after the Civil War. Healthcare was one reason we did well. We had graduates of this school here. Claude Smith discovered hookworm. We had Floyd McRae, who becomes a great abdominal surgeon and co-founders of Piedmont Hospital. So there were these outstanding physicians. We also had Abner Calhoun, the ophthalmologist, who was on the faculty of the medical school. But my opinion is Atlanta did well because something we did not have. We did not have cholera. There were no cases of cholera in Atlanta. Cholera was on the eastern seaboard in all the major cities, probably brought to this country by immigrants. And we had no yellow fever. We may have had a case here or there in 1878 during the great yellow fever epidemic that hit the New Orleans and Memphis. There was no yellow fever during the Civil War. And the reason why is because the Navy blockade prevented ships coming in from Cuba and Brazil that carried the mosquito that caused yellow fever. In 1878, the yellow fever mosquito hit New Orleans again. Almost 5,000 people died. It went up the Mississippi River and killed about 5,500 people in Memphis. I was in Memphis for one of my reunions a few years ago, and I stopped up at the cemetery. They are still finding bones of people buried from that epidemic who were buried at night and didn't have a marker and had no right to bury the family there. But the people would come out at night and bury their loved one. And so when somebody buys a plot of land in Memphis at the Elmwood Cemetery, and they dig it up your site after you die, they'll find bones from somebody from probably 1878. If you get yellow fever, about 15 to 20% of those people will die. Well over 100,000 people die annually around the world, but we have not had any yellow fever in this country since I think it was 1943. We have stopped it, but again, Atlantis became great again. One of my thinking is we had railroads, we had everything else, and we had industrial people, but we lacked two things. We did not have yellow fever, and we did not have cholera. The yellow fever epidemic that hit Memphis in 1878, those people fled. The only people who died in Memphis, for all practical purposes, were poor whites and poor blacks. And the poor whites were usually Irish immigrants. Everybody else fled. And some of the people that fled Memphis came to Atlanta and helped make this city prosper. And I think that summarizes it. Any questions? I do have one comment. In 1866, the white population died at a rate of about 25 per 100. Blacks were dying at a rate of 40 per 100. In 1870, the black death rate was 70 per 1,000. In 1870, there were 3,000 fewer black citizens in Atlanta than there were in 1866. 1/3 of the decrease in the black population was probably due to them leaving the city and going back to the farms to work. But 2/3 were due to disease. The black population was decimated by typhoid fever, which is salmonella, dysentery. Dysentery is not just diarrhea. Dysentery is diarrhea with blood and mucus in the stools. Diphtheria, smallpox hit the blacks again, and finally meningitis. There's an organism called Neisseria that raged during that time and was uniformly fatal. I was telling Cy, my last patient that I lost in private practice was a Georgia Tech freshman. He was a student here. He went home for lunch to see his mother at 12 o'clock, told his mother it didn't feel well. And she said, well, stay home. He said, no, I gotta go to class. I had class at 3 o'clock. Gets in his car, drives down 75, stops his car, can't make it, goes back home. She takes him to an emergency facility. They transfer him to Northside Hospital. Probably about 4 o'clock. He was in a coma at 6 and died that evening. This is about 10 years ago. That disease is probably going to disappear. I'm sure I look at these young people here, and you've probably all been immunized against meningococcus. If you haven't, you should be. Any questions? Thank you.
What was the state of research at about this time, maybe in the Atlanta Medical College, and in the medical profession itself? What did research mean?
Not much. You could hardly get bodies. You know where Johnson's Ferry Road is here in Atlanta? Johnson himself died, and his body disappeared. He was buried, and the next day it was gone. It was stolen and taken to the medical school. Drug-wise, not much. You know, Europe was doing things, you know, with Pasteur and Codgen and those kind of people, but not much here. In the Civil War, there were 3 stethoscopes in the Northern Army. There were no stethoscopes in the Southern Army. Now, the stethoscope was created in 1822 in France, but we had no stethoscopes in the South. I mean, how do you diagnose anything? And if you did diagnose it, what are you going to treat them with? There's so few drugs. Quinine was not available. Quinine was given at the drop of a hat. Anytime you had a fever, you got quinine. You know, I don't want to sound like I'm unbalanced, like our previous speaker said, but I think sometimes that George Washington had quinine toxicity. He lost his hearing, and he lost his vision. He had malaria 9 times that we know of. And he took quinine like I drink beer. Not 9 times, no, but seriously, it's probably could have had quinine poisoning. I wouldn't say that other than this group, but he was an ill man, and his hearing and his vision was gone, and that's quinine toxicity. But really not much research. Claude Smith did research on hookworm. There was a gentleman by the name of Stiles who looked at hookworm in animals in Europe, and then he came to the United States. He was American, and he spoke to a reporter, and he said that he thought hookworm caused laziness. So the New York Times, fake news, germ found that causes laziness. That was an article.
What year was that?
This was 1898. So, and it made big news. It was big news. But Claude Smith really got it started in Georgia. He proved that hookworm is endemic in Georgia. The Rockefeller Sanitary Commission, Rockefeller was trying to buy his way into heaven, and he allocated $1 million, and they treated 75,000 men, women, and children between 1910 and 1915 for hookworm. 1922, they did a stool exams on the freshmen at Emory. 22% of them had hookworm in 1922. So it's still around. Just when you go out in the grass, wear shoes.
All right, I'm not an academic, but I have handouts. So I'll rely on you to circulate those. Well, Chris is getting me set up. Doug introduced me. I'm Charlie Crawford, Georgia Battlefield Association. I'm going to talk about the Army's role, and you're going to give me a walk around. Yeah. Yeah, standing behind a lectern always strikes me as a little bit pretentious. Of course, now that the other speakers have done that, I'm by default calling them pretentious, and that's not what I've intended, but I just don't do that. So I walk around a bit because I want to make eye contact and give people other than the ones sitting right in front of me the idea that I'm talking to them as well. So, the Army's role in reconstructing Atlanta. Okay. I gave you the handouts, and they should come in handy for a lot of the presentations. It lists all the governors, the population of Atlanta over a period of years, et cetera, so that way we don't have to discuss all that during this. But as far as the U.S. Army goes, at the end of the war, we're talking about May of 1865, there was a cavalry corps based in Macon, and there was an infantry division based in Savannah. And the first cavalry regiment to arrive in Atlanta, now remember, Sherman and the rest of the Union Army had left in November 1864, so there's a gap there before the Federals arrive again. The 1st Ohio Regiment arrived in Atlanta on 4th of May, 1865. And the regimental commander was put in charge, but then he was quickly supplanted by Colonel Felix Salmson. If you want some entertainment, go home tonight and Google Felix Salmson, and you'll have a lot to read about, and his wife Agnes. I won't waste time talking about that now, but just, when you have 5 minutes or 10 minutes, go look up Salmson. So he stayed until October 1865, and then an infantry regiment was permanently ensconced in the city. I say permanently, but for long term. What are the occupational challenges? There's no federal government infrastructure to deal with a situation like rebuilding half the country. Think about what the interaction with the federal government was for people in the 1860s. FEMA? There's no FEMA. Income tax? There's no income tax. Social Security? There's no, yeah. You got it, Dorothy. The U.S. Post Office was about the only interaction most people had with the federal government. So, who gets this job? The U.S. Army. And they're going to have a large role in putting the country back together. And I have to guard against evolving this into a history of Reconstruction, because I want to try and keep my focus more on Atlanta and on Georgia. But it's, in so many cases, the policies that were promulgated applied throughout the country, or throughout the South, or throughout the reconstructed areas. So, there's no plan or document. Most people that have been in the military know that if you want to know how to do something, you go to the shelf and you pull out the operations manual for that particular contingency. No such thing back then. So, there's no plan or doctrine for occupation, not for the Army, not for anybody. There's no other agency that's about to take this on. The Mexican War occupation experience had been 20 years prior, and it really wasn't for the same purpose, and it didn't last very long. And then if you look at the wartime occupation experience, there were parts of several states that had already been occupied by the Army and run by the Army. But that was always thought to be a temporary thing until the end of the war. Well, now the end of the war has come. Who gets the task? The U.S. Army. Some volunteer officers had been civil administrators, and John Geary always comes to mind. When the Federals occupied Atlanta in the fall of 1864, Geary was given the job of being military administrator of the city by General Sherman. Why did he pick John Geary? John Geary had already been mayor of San Francisco and territorial governor of Kansas. So put him in charge of military or civil administration of the city. The officers were quite well aware of the lack of guidance they were getting. The one who was in charge of Georgia was George Thomas. I have to remind myself that many people in this audience won't be familiar with some of these characters. George Thomas was a native Virginian, but he wound up being one of the most important Union officers during the Civil War. And I put up the dates there. The military division of the Tennessee actually included Georgia and Alabama and Florida. So Thomas was a de facto in charge. But he didn't spend a lot of his time here. The individual states were divided up into sections. The northwest sector of Georgia, as it was called, included Atlanta. There was a General Stevenson that was here most of the time. Now, Thomas did visit, and he did promulgate orders and directives that applied throughout, including Atlanta. But Thomas was the guy that was, I want to say titularly in charge. He was actually in charge, but he didn't happen to be in Atlanta. How do you fill the vacuum? General Schofield was in charge in North Carolina at that time, and he wrote down the quote that I have there. I sure would like to have some guidance because I don't have any right now, so I'm just going to have to do. And thank God for the U.S. Army in the sense that these guys figured, well, if you don't give me guidance, I'm going to do something anyway. So one of the, I think, still qualities of the United States military is you can tell me what to do, but if you don't tell me what to do, I'm still going to do something. And so that's what Schofield said about doing. And he said, and I think this is probably characteristic of a lot of the South, he said, the people really want certainty or predictability, and they'll accept almost any kind of certainty or predictability. So here's an opportunity. But it was not that long, but in the interim, he decided, well, these people are hungry, I'll give them as much food as I can. They can't get where they need to go, I'll provide as much transportation as I can, especially regarding paroled Confederate soldiers that had been surrendered and signed their parole. Schofield did what he could to try and get them home. And this would apply, as near as I can tell, to all the other military commanders throughout the South, to varying degrees. Since there was no uniform policy, they didn't all do it to the same extent. But in Georgia and Atlanta, that helped as well, as they tried to get people home. Thomas started to have to delve into the political realm because people were taking action. Leftover Georgia, if you didn't get a handout, I got more. People were starting to take action, some of which was contrary to the intent of the South having lost, which to this day there's a lot of people that don't believe the South lost or don't understand that they lost. But what Thomas decided was at a local level, where I can't have the Army everywhere, judges, sheriffs, local government officials, you guys continue to do your job the way you've always done your job, and I'll let you know if you do something I don't approve of. But anybody at the higher levels, like governors and legislators, you guys are out. You're the ones that seceded. You're the ones that started this damn war. You guys are out. Andrew Johnson then, at the end of May 1865, says, okay, all states should have conventions to get together and amend their state constitutions so that slavery is no longer permitted. Okay, so here's now at least a general statement of something that has to be done that comes from the very top. But he also says military commanders should not hinder loyal people from forming state governments. This is going to begin to be the break between Johnson and the military. The longer this goes on, the more they're going to think that Andrew Johnson almost himself doesn't believe that the South lost. And that's going to form the ultimate split. The Freedmen's Bureau had been created by Lincoln before Johnson took over as president. And Oliver Howard, who was a distinguished general during the war, was put in charge in May of 1865, and he's actually going to continue in that role until July of 1874. Howard, shown at the bottom right, man from Maine, very pious man. If that term existed at that time, they would have called him a Bible thumper. But he was still a very competent military officer as well. And he also happened to have one arm. He lost the other one at Seven Pines in 1862. And there's a kind of an interesting parallel here you'll see in a minute. Most of the administrators of the Freedmen's Bureau were Army officers. And so in the absence of firm Freedmen's Bureau guidance or indecision, they would do what they knew from being in the Army. They fed, and they clothed, and they tried to find work for the freedmen. They issued 150,000 rations per day in the summer of 1865. Now that's not just in Atlanta, but that's still an awful lot of food that they're handing out. And I know they did it in this area. There was an officer named Henry Judah, and he is, I don't want to say memorialized, but there's a plaque to him up in Marietta from where his headquarters was there at the Archibald House. Because in the summer of 1865, the South didn't have a lot of food because there hadn't been anybody to plant crops in the spring of 1865. And Judah, basically on his own hook, decided, well, these people are starving, I'm going to give them food. So all this stuff about, the Yankees are terrible, they burned Atlanta to the ground, false. They denied, women and children food, false. Okay, get those out of your head. The other thing that almost certainly, you can imagine why this happened. Freedmen's Bureau and Army presence tended to be concentrated where the people were. So they tended to be in the larger cities and towns. So over the course of the next few years, a lot of the worst instances of white on black violence are going to occur in the more rural areas or the smaller towns. Davis Tilson was the assistant commissioner of the Freedmen's Bureau for Georgia. Howard had one arm, Tilson had one foot. He lost it in battle. He was a volunteer officer, but he was given the Freedmen's Bureau job, and he put out a work order, an order in October of 1865 that says, find work for unemployed freedmen. This is to the subordinates in the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay? A lot of the slaves that had been in the countryside for years and years and years decided they hadn't been allowed to go to the big city, and they were going to do so. So they did. But what that does is it brings a whole bunch of people to town, and not all of them can find jobs. And so Tilson very decidedly decided the Freedmen's Bureau should try and find jobs for whatever freedmen were around. Refuse rations to able-bodied who won't work. This is like welfare reform, okay? And it's discussion going on today in the state legislature about why are you entitled to welfare if you're able-bodied and won't work. There was a rumor going around that the slaves would get free land at Christmas time. Now, there's the famous Special Order Number 15 issued down in Savannah in late 1864, which Johnson had refuted about the 40 acres and a mule. But who knows how these rumors get started, but nonetheless it was circulating among the African American community. Come Christmas time, all the freed slaves or ex-slaves would get free land. And Tilson worked very hard to try and dispel that rumor. But what he discovered was it wasn't until after Christmas and everybody decided, well, I guess it wasn't true. And then they really got serious about finding a work contract. Now, if this work contract had been entered into, Tilson believed in enforcing contracts, both by the one who was supposed to do the work and the one who solicited the work. So he was equally hard on both blacks and whites about if you have entered into a work contract, by God, you're going to have to live up to it. Otherwise, the Freedmen's Bureau isn't going to support you. And then you notice the one down at the bottom corner relates to the same thing. If you don't find yourself a work contract on your own, we'll find one for you. So when you talk about rebuilding the city, Tilson has an awful lot to do with that because he was the one that said, everybody's got to work. What were the Army's responsibilities in general? This is not Freedmen's Bureau now. Look at that list. Is that the Army's task as you understand it today? No. But we were presented with a situation, I was going to say unique to the time. It's unique in our history. We had to try and put the country back together, and the only government agency that was really effectively doing it was the U.S. Army. 1866 Atlanta. City and county finances were strapped, and that's not unique to Atlanta. That's generic throughout the South. The Army was spending money here because they had troops here. In the same way, nobody wants to give up their bases whenever they have one of those base realignment and closing commission things. As much as they politically resented the U.S. Army in the South, the Army was helping them out financially, not only by giving them stuff, but by spending money, paying the troops, and the troops go out and buy things. Or they're building things, or they're buying supplies for the troops, or they're having local work contracts to build barracks for the troops. One thing the mayor did is, and you see the 1864 photo of Union troops on the City Hall grounds. In 1865, they were camped there again, and the mayor asked them to move. He said, one, we need to do some repair work on City Hall, which survived the war. Atlanta was burned to the ground. False. City Hall survived the war. And the drums disrupted church services on Sunday. So the Army said, all right, we'll take care of that. But it'll take, first we'll have to build a spot to put them. So by 1867, they came up with the McPherson Barrack, named for General McPherson, who had been killed during the Battle of Atlanta. And they built it out, and Cy alluded to the racetrack and the arsenal, which are down here. And that's where Spelman College is today. McPherson Barracks was sited here. There was more of the city street structure up in here, but I didn't include it all because I wanted to give you an idea of where it was in relation to what the downtown was. Here's the Cons House. That's where the military district commander would be ensconced. The Opera House, which is going to wind up being where the state legislature is ensconced. And so here's downtown. The provost marshal is here. Here's City Hall. This is about 1.5 miles to here. So even on foot, and even in an Army formation, you can cover 1.5 miles in not that much time. And so if there was trouble downtown, this is where the troops are going to come from, is the McPherson Barracks. I should mention too, notice it's active from 1867 to 1881. And a lot of times we think about, the corrupt bargain of Rutherford B. Hayes being elected president and agreeing to withdraw all the troops from the South in 1877. McPherson Barracks stayed active till 1881. So by that time, the city of Atlanta said, maybe this isn't such a bad deal to have at least some troop presence in the city. Now, the Army would leave in 1881, but then come 1885, they come back and they build where Fort McPherson is today, which is a few miles south of here. So, what did the Georgia look like? This photo is often described as being taken in 1864, and Dr. Moran used a photo of the destroyed Georgia Railroad Bank Agency, which is described as 1864. Those are both wrong. They were taken in 1866. Most of Bernard's photos were taken in 1864. The one he used in this one happened to be taken in 1866. Atlanta was burned to the ground. Well, then how come there's all these buildings in the background that are exactly the same place as they were in 1864? Okay? You can go to the state capitol grounds today and see a plaque that says Atlanta was burned to the ground, nothing was left. Not true. Now, was stuff destroyed? Oh, you bet. But to say it was burned to the ground and nothing was left is wrong. Here's where the car shed used to be, the big railroad depot. It's not there anymore because the Federals did destroy that in November 1864. This is the fire engine house.
They didn't burn it.
No, well, they did eventually. First they knocked it down and then they burned it. Yeah. So it was only knocked down for I think 3 days before they set it on fire. But the classic photo of the car shed is in that interim period where it's just knocked down. Here's the fire engine house, pre-war structure, still there. Here's a lot of the buildings in the background that are the same, was there in 1864. And then one of the reasons you can tell this wasn't taken in 1864, can you think of any reason in the world why the Federals would leave all these locomotives in shape and intact in 1864? No. The roundhouse is still destroyed, but the turntable's been put back in operation. And Cy alluded to the idea that the railroads had been put back in operation by 1865. Yeah. So here's your railroads in operation, and here's all these engines being used by the railroad, and the main railroad line is right here. Still is today, by the way. So elsewhere in 1866, 1866 was actually the peak year for white-on-black violence post-war. The worst incident of post-war white-on-black violence was actually in 1873 in New Orleans. But in terms of overall numbers, 1866 was the worst year. There was a Memphis mob that was suppressed by troops. And in the wake of that, now General Grant is now General, well, he had been General in Chief, but he's still General in Chief of the Army. He directs soldiers to arrest offenders when civil authorities cannot or will not. So some of you that have the legal persuasion are probably thinking, posse comitatus, he can't do that. Posse comitatus was not enacted until 1878. So the Army is very effectively now the ultimate police authority. So if they won't arrest white people in the same way as if they would arrest black people for the same crime, Grant says the Army will. In July, there was a riot in New Orleans, 38 killed, and that began to influence the northern populace that perhaps the president's policies were too lenient. In November comes what's going to be the presage to what we call congressional Reconstruction. The Republicans gained a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress. So, you know, when you have a 2/3 majority, you can override a presidential veto. There's going to be a lot of that in the next couple of years. And that leads directly to the 1867 Reconstruction Acts. When the Congress convenes, they put out on the 2nd of March, 10 states are now going to be put directly under military rule, not de facto, which they kind of had been. Now it's going to be a formalized policy that there will be military rule of the South. 5 military districts, each commanded by a general with broad powers. A little later in the month, that was passed over Johnson's veto. Later in the month, they specified the procedure for regaining representation in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. District commanders were the ones in charge of calling elections for delegates to draft new states' constitutions. And once a state had ratified the 14th Amendment, and that's on your handout, and has a new constitution granting Negro suffrage, Congress will decide whether to seat the representatives and senators. Part of the reason this came about is because in 1866, the Georgia legislature, as it then existed, had nominated 2 senators. Remember, back then, senators were not popularly elected. It was done by the state legislatures. And the 2 they nominated were Herschel Johnson, a former Confederate senator, and Alexander Stephens, the Confederate vice president. At which point the U.S. Congress says, you're not taking us seriously, and would not seat either one of them. So then comes this Congressional Reconstruction Act that says, if you want back into the U.S. Congress, no matter whether you're Georgia or any other state, you got to follow these rules. By the 19th of July, the state governments previously established were illegal, but they can remain until replaced. Look at that last line. No district commander shall be bound in his action by any opinion of any civil officer of the United States. The Army is in charge. So, we had a succession of 3rd military district commanders over the years. I'm showing them all here at once so you can see what the dates are. And then we had the circumstance where an Army officer actually served as provisional governor for about 7 months. So let's talk about them. First one was John Pope. He arrived late in March of 1867. He said, this is really an unpleasant duty, and I'm not looking forward to this. But very quickly, he decided that he had to put out some overall guidance, and he promulgated General Order Number 1 soon after his arrival. Civil officers can stay in office as long as justice is faithfully and impartially administered. If you arrest a black man for his vagrancy and you don't arrest any white people for vagrancy, that's not faithfully administering the law. Do not attempt to influence others to oppose Reconstruction. I don't know how you would do that, but I mean, if you put out a newspaper and said Reconstruction is bad, that was a violation, and Pope would shut down the press. No elections except those specified by the U.S. Congress. He orders mayor and police to be present in public meetings. The white mayors and the white police officers in the various cities of his 3rd military district, which was Georgia, Alabama, and Florida, including Atlanta, of course, they had a tendency to avoid meetings where they thought there was going to be trouble. And so that way, the white people could kill, maim, beat, otherwise disparage black people, and the mayor and the police chief could say, well, we didn't know anything about it. Pope changes that. He says, if there's a meeting, you have to be there, and that way you can't deny responsibility or deny knowledge. The Army would be in charge of registering voters for these constitutional conventions. We don't think of the Army's role as being that. In fact, now it's probably illegal. Not then. And then in August came, and Pope was kind of tolerated up to this point, but in August came, tolerated by the Southerners, in August came the breaking point. He cracked down on newspapers. He forbade all white juries. In other words, if you have all these trials and you have nothing but white people on the jury, it's an invalid trial. And then he started filling civil office vacancies himself. First he fired the people that wouldn't comply, and then he put in the people he wanted. By December, he ordered the state treasurer to pay $40,000 for the Constitutional Convention expenses, and this was the real break, because this became so onerous that President Johnson decided to remove him. And it figured his level of unpopularity just got to such an extreme that he could no longer function effectively. So he's going to replace Pope. Let me briefly talk about 1867, because we're now up to December as far as Pope is concerned. In May, the Ku Klux Klan had been reorganized in Nashville with Nathan Bedford Forrest named the Grand Wizard. Interestingly, Forrest would dissolve the Ku Klux Klan the following year because he found it uncontrollable. So this idea of some master plan for the Ku Klux Klan throughout the South is false. Almost all Klaverns operated on an individual basis. And Forrest found this, being a military man, anathema. And because he could not control them from a central location or with central directives, he disbanded the Ku Klux Klan in Tennessee in 1868. Nonetheless, we're talking about 1867. He was named the Grand Wizard. Interestingly, in Georgia, Forrest was suffering from what we think today is Crohn's disease, although he was not diagnosed with that at the time. And so when he was too ill, the guy that took over in Georgia was John Gordon. And to this day, the Gordon family still doesn't like people to know that he did that. But John Gordon was probably the head of the Klan in Georgia. And he was a great reconciliator. He was always giving speeches about let's get together with the North and put the country back together again. And he served as U.S. Senator and then Georgia Governor and then U.S. Senator again. But all the time behind the scenes, he had a hand in running the Klan. In May, there was a riot in Mobile, Alabama. The Secretary of War, Stanton, directed the troops be stationed in towns rather than on the periphery of the towns. So the McPherson Barracks would still qualify. It was somewhat on the periphery of town, but still not that far away. General Pope directed at that point if civil authorities failed to do their duties, they can be removed from office, and he fired the Mobile mayor and the police chief. Okay, and then in August, President Johnson suspended Secretary of War Stanton because Johnson and Stanton were having a real clash over policy of Reconstruction. So, Pope is discharged in December of 1867. In January of 1868, General Meade arrives. Initially, he's welcomed. They have a big banquet for him, attended by, among other people, John Gordon. But in less than 2 weeks, Meade found it necessary to remove the governor and the treasurer, who had refused to pay the $40,000 for the Constitutional Convention, and he appointed Brevet Brigadier General Ruger as the provisional governor. He removed the comptroller and the Secretary of State. By March, the Constitutional Convention had been successfully concluded, and Meade specified the April vote on the proposed new Constitution. He declared 2 Democratic nominees for governor ineligible because they did not meet the criteria of having been pardoned. He had the City Hall polling place guarded by military troops, and sure enough, I wouldn't call it a fair election, but one that more equally represented the thoughts or the voting intent of the black population as well as the white population, a Republican was elected governor. Was there some funny business? I'm sure there was. Some white vote was probably suppressed, but in this case, it was probably closer to a fair election than anything the Democrats had ever, the previous Georgia administration had ever done. By July, Meade had removed the Ruger as the provisional governor. He thought it was no longer necessary. And you talk about optics. This is the pre-TV days, but nonetheless, Meade decided to sit next to Governor Bullock at the convening of the state legislature on July the 4th. Just to show, okay, here's your newly elected governor, but don't forget who's really the power behind the throne. One of the things that Meade did, and I think I didn't find that many specific cases, but in this one instance I did, he actually persuaded Northern investors to help with church repairs because he figured, well, I can appeal to you as a Methodist or a Presbyterian because these are your fellow Presbyterians and fellow Methodists. Granted, they're Southerners, but nonetheless are the same denomination. And Meade explicitly sought donations from the Northern congregations to help put the Southern churches back together. Of course, he couldn't do that for the Baptists because the Baptists are still split, as they are to this day. So the 1868 census in Georgia during Meade's tenure, there was a March murder of a scalawag. A scalawag is a Southerner who actually reports republicanism. The guy's name happened to be Ashburn in Columbus. Meade, in the wake of this murder, replaced the mayor, the city council, and several others. The Army arrested 13 people in conjunction with the incidents that occurred in the wake of the murder. 10 were white, 3 were black. Meade directed a trial by military commission. How come he didn't get a civil trial? Well, because Meade didn't think it would be fair. The judge suspended the trial because Georgia actually got readmitted during 1868. It allegedly had met the criteria. It had a new legislature. It ratified the 14th Amendment. But then comes the September riot in Camilla, because one of the things the new Georgia legislature did was it threw out all the black members that had been elected. And one of the black members protested down in Camilla, assembled some other black people, and they decided they would have a protest. The sheriff went in and got a posse together who came out, and one of the guys, alcohol was involved, was drunk and armed, and he shot at the black protesters. They spent the rest of the day hunting down the black protesters in the woods and in the streets of the town of Camilla. and they wound up killing 9 and wounding 35. Some white people were also wounded just because of the general melee and chaos. But nonetheless, Meade says now the Army investigation will proceed, and it showed the sheriff deserved the blame, and the mayor refuses to investigate. So what Meade then said was, since we now have a functioning governor, or at least an elected governor, I'll have the legislatures ask for federal troops to come in, but the legislatures, same people that had kicked out the black legislators to begin with, declined to invite the federal troops. The provisional governor that we talked about briefly was Ruger. One of the things, to go back to Pope, we can thank him for, he demanded that the congressional or the constitutional convention be held in Atlanta. The capital of Georgia at the time was Milledgeville. Why not Milledgeville? Because what he found was all the black delegates that had been elected couldn't find accommodations in Milledgeville, so he insisted that the convention be held in Atlanta. That's going to accelerate the trend to move the state capital to Atlanta. When Ruger is provisional government, when he was provisional governor, the decision was actually made by the legislature to move the capital to Atlanta, and so Ruger was the one that actually had the Army take all the furniture from the state capitol in Milledgeville and bring it to Atlanta, where it was ensconced in the Opera House until a new capitol could be built. So what happened to Atlanta City Hall? That's why Atlanta City Hall isn't there anymore. It was torn down from the new state capitol, not because the Federals burned it when they left. One of the things we can't say we thank Ruger for, is he was the first one to authorize convict leasing, which was a scourge that persisted well into the 20th century. He said, work needs to be done on the railroad, so why don't you just put some of these convicts to work? And the lease system was manifestly unfair, but nonetheless, Ruger was the one that approved that.
Form of re-slavery that was actually explicitly permitted by the
Yeah.
13th Amendment?
Comes the second end of military rule. The legislature ratifies the 14th Amendment. Congress approves representation from the states listed there, and I use the post office abbreviation. If you can't figure out what they are, I can tell you. By 30th of July, 1868, Ruger was removed as provisional governor by Meade. Military authority was lifted. The 3rd Military District was replaced by a military department of the South. Troops remain in Atlanta, Savannah, and Dahlonega, but the Kimball Opera House was chosen as a temporary capital. The legislature expelled all Negro members, as I mentioned. In October, to be somewhat even-handed about this, the Army also brought problems as well as solutions. Again, alcohol was involved. There was a riot in the old 4th Ward where 12 to 15 soldiers confronted the police, and there were some people wounded. Soldiers didn't routinely, these are infantrymen, so they don't routinely carry rifles when they go out on the town. But the police, of course, were trying to hurt them, and some of them had pistols, and so there was some shooting. In November, the Atlanta City Council authorized the Negro vote. So now we get to 1869. Now comes the 15th Amendment, which you have in your handout. The Georgia legislature adjourned after voting against the 15th Amendment. In other words, they would not approve it. In May, Senator Wilson, a Republican from Massachusetts, asked President Grant's now president, to prevent further political murders in Georgia, the worst of all states, as far as he was concerned, as far as political murders went. The department commander, remember now we're going from military district to a department, was now Alfred Terry, and he reported to the Secretary of War that the Ku Klux Klan operates with impunity in rural Georgia, not many incidents in Atlanta that I could find. And he proposes that Congress resume military administration because the state had violated conditions by expelling Negro legislators and seating former Confederates in their stead. In December then, Congress returned Georgia military rule and directs the legislature to remove unauthorized members and approve the 15th Amendment. So here's about Alfred Terry. Terry and Republican Governor Bullock disqualified 19 of the legislators that had been put in place of the black legislators. The legislature then did ratify the 15th Amendment and re-ratified the 14th Amendment, and Congress again ended military rule on the 15th of July, which makes Georgia the last state readmitted to the Union. So, what did the Army do? The Army provided food, clothing, transportation, and medical care, provided civil administration and justice, you can read the list as well as I did. But my point is, Atlanta did a lot to build itself back up. And there was many people who deserve some credit for doing that. But without the overall influence of the U.S. Army, I don't think it would have occurred nearly as fast and not nearly in as orderly a fashion. Thanks.
Take a couple questions.
If you want, sure.
Do we have?
There you go. Thank you. Good? Good to go? All right. Are there questions? Here we go.
Oh, there are?
Looks like
Okay,
there
go
are.
ahead.
Before lunch, we'll take a couple of questions. Then,
I was hoping that since it's close to lunchtime, everybody would say, the heck with that, let's just go.
to heck with it, let's just
No,
go.
but
Oh,
you
no, no.
have a question. You already called on someone. I did, yeah. Go ahead.
Would you comment on the impeachment of President Johnson?
I could, but I'm not really well qualified to do that. There's probably, I know 3 other historians in the room that probably know more about that than I do. But basically, it got to the point where the Congress, which I think was legitimately reflecting the feeling of the Northern populace, began to think that Johnson wasn't interested in sufficiently punishing the South for its transgression. And there was, I alluded to it, and it wasn't the focus of the presentation, that there was several occurrences where they wound up passing stuff over his veto because they just didn't feel that he was going in the right direction. Now, was Congress a bit overboard? Yes, they were. But I think Johnson had decided, no, I don't want to say that because I just don't feel qualified to say it. But nonetheless, you get an impeachment when the Congress decides that they don't think the president's doing the right thing. That's the only way you get impeachment, is the House has to vote to impeach and the Senate has to have a trial. A lot of people, when they think impeachment, think that's saying no. Unfortunately, we have a recent example. Those of you who remember the Clinton area, Clinton was impeached, but he was not tried. Well, and he was tried, but he was not convicted. Okay. Nixon was on the verge of being impeached. He was never impeached. He resigned. So if you want to talk about an impeached president, everybody thinks Nixon. No, Clinton. But anyway, it came down to a situation where a lot of people, even though they felt, a lot of Congress or a lot of senators felt, even though Johnson had not been following the right policy, they knew that this was going to be a big deal to remove a sitting president with a trial. And I think that influenced as many of them who actually agreed with them. I think the Senate was fairly well convinced that they did not like the way Johnson was heading, but removing a sitting president from office was just too big a pill for them to swallow.
What about the riot in the old Fourth Ward? Who was that?
Well, it was drunken soldiers. It was about a dozen to 15 of them, and they were just basically, breaking windows and doing the kind of thing drunk people do, and the police tried to get them to stop. So it wasn't white on black, it was white on white.
What year was that?
1868, I believe.
Yeah, the one thing you didn't mention was the carpetbaggers. What role did they play, and what was the whole influence of what was going on?
I didn't find enough specifics on Atlanta to feel comfortable talking about what the influence of carpetbagging was. Did people from the north come to the south and try and take advantage of the situation? Oh, you bet they did. But that's what a carpetbagger is. That's a northerner who comes south. A scalawag is a southerner who actually apostate, that actually goes over the Republican side. So the thing about the carpetbagging label is so much of what went on in the South in the way of rebuilding occurred from Northerners who were well motivated and genuinely concerned about rebuilding the South. There's a percentage of them that exploited the situation, used it for their own, aggrandizement and nefarious purposes. But nonetheless, some carpetbaggers from the North were necessary because they had the money. If you look at some of the people from England, I mean, they're not only carpetbaggers. There was a substantial number of people from England who came and invested in the South because they saw an opportunity, like buying stocks when the market's down. I mean, this appealed to a lot of people that had any sort of economic foundation at all. So what was the influence of carpetbaggers? I don't want to give you a generalization that was positive or negative because I don't feel qualified to say that. But just remember there was some of both.
There's one.
Oh, there's another one.
In the back.
Do you think that the Army should have stayed in the South longer? Considering what happened after, when the state became part of the United
Well,
States
I mean,
and Reconstructing.
well, and the worst, it's hard to say what's worse. You know, we had a civil rights movement in the 1960s, and I'm old enough to remember that, and that's 100 years after it should have happened. But it actually got worse later in the 19th century. Grant, you know, the Southerners went to a lot of trouble to screw up the textbooks around 1900 and to purport, you know, why the war was fought, who won, you know, our brave soldiers, all that stuff. Were they brave? Oh, you bet. They were fighting for a very bad purpose, and there's no denying that. But one of the things they also did was they slurred Grant. Grant, during his tenure, tried very hard to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment and ensure that black people were treated equally. And he couldn't literally do that because we're still racist today. I mean, it was worse then. So you can't guarantee that someone's going to be treated equally, but you can try to guarantee that they're going to be treated the same under the law. And Grant did that. And for that, he was resented still resented in the South to this day. When Hayes won the election in 1876, and there's a whole other discussion can be had about that, Hayes then did this quote-unquote corrupt bargain to pull the Army out of most of the South. Should they have stayed longer? I don't know. That's one of those hypotheticals that I don't know how to answer. The Army needed to get out of the role of being the police of the South, because the longer it went on, the more it was rife for abuse both directions. And it's not really something in our era. Nobody here remembers an Army that actually functioned as the police. And we're normally glad when they don't. And in other countries where they do, we have very, skeptical view of that. So I don't think it was something they could have continued to do. There probably needed to be more enforcement of the amendments and the laws, but I don't know that the Army was the right agency to do that. But then again, the federal government at that point had nobody else to do it. So should they have stayed longer? It's a debate worth having, but I don't know. You had a question.
We should.
Relationship with Washington prior to December of that year, in terms of, was he being supported in his actions before that? Or was it
I'm sorry, was who being supported?
Pope, in terms of his policies?
Yeah, well, there's somewhat the same record to be played over and over with Pope and Meade. When they arrived, there was this sort of, when Pope first arrived, there was no predecessor, but they said, well, just from what he said publicly. Remember, Pope's also from Kentucky, and his family owned slaves. So there was this hope that, maybe from what he said and from what his family background is, things will be okay. Well, then Pope became so onerous that almost anybody looked good by comparison. So when Meade arrives, they thought, oh, well, here's a chance for a fresh start. Maybe he won't be as much of a anti-Southerner as Pope turned out to be. They were wrong about that as well. So I forget, does that answer the question to some degree? Okay.
Charlie, I'm gonna have to
That's fine.
intervene, but
He's gonna intervene.
now you can. There you go.
I hate to cut off that question and answer. That was really great. Good questions, good answers. I know there were extra questions for Dr. Moran and for Charlie. Wow, I learned a lot right then in those two talks. And so I hope you did too. I know you did too. It's time to break for lunch. Otherwise, and so if you have questions for Dr. Moran and Charlie Crawford,
We'll run away.
they won't run away. They'll be here, and I hope these discussions continue between yourselves and the speakers, and also just amongst yourselves. We are now going to break for lunch, but before we do, I want to recognize a few people. One who's not on the program is the program director at the National Archives Atlanta branch and a good friend of the history department, history and sociology department here at Tech, and that's Joel Walker. Raise your hand, stand up for us, Joel. And I also want to point out that were you able to bring any materials?
I have about 50 copies of a finding aid on our Freedmen's Bureau microfilm. We have the entire records, but it's a microfilm. And then we also have some very interesting Reconstruction era civil rights cases, especially out of South Carolina. We have about 300 of those, which is a massive number, and I brought a finding aid for those. So
Okay, in case you...
I'll put them on the table back there, just help yourself.
Excellent, excellent. So there are very rich materials here at the Atlanta branch of the National Archives on the Freedmen's Bureau, on the Reconstruction era, particularly civil rights cases. And he's brought finding aids for those collections. They'll be at a table in the back. So make sure you stop by and take a look at those. We also have poster sessions that will be taking place during lunch, and please stop by. I want to in particular recognize two students who are majoring in history, technology, and society, and that would be Jonathan Weinberg and Ali Yildirim. And they have worked very hard and done some very original research on this issue, on the issues of Atlanta. Jonathan working on Atlanta as the cradle of education, and Ali working on the question of survival and the kind of difficulties we have in knowing exactly what happened in the immediate post-war area, between the time Sherman left and the time the Freedmen's Bureau showed up, what exactly happened. And so Ali's done good posters on that, and they will be standing by their posters to answer whatever questions you might have during lunch. Rachel, are you here? Hi, Rachel. We've not met, but I'm Doug. And she will be perhaps by her Resilient Atlanta posters as well to answer your questions about that. Without further ado then, lunch is in the back and it smells pretty good. So you're all welcome to it. We'll reconvene as the program suggests at 1:30 for the next session.